one of them was about to die. They stood at the epicenter of the battle, beneath a sky that was burning, and it seemed as though time stood still. The black-armored paragon of humanity brought a golden-winged power sword around in a crackling two-handed strike. His pale face was twisted in hatred, and his eyes were tinged red with blood rage. Despite the thickness of his enemy's bull-like neck, the blow was perfectly timed, delivered with all his gene-enhanced and armor-augmented strength. His opponent was a hulking green-skinned monster that stood over 2.5 meters tall. It lived only for battle, and knew, nay cared for nothing else. It roared as it swung its chugging chain glaive around in a brutal arc, a blow that could carve the Space Marine clean in two. Either blow would be mortal if it landed. Both would land within a single heartbeat, but that heartbeat would never come. Trazyn the Infinite stepped between the two frozen combatants, inspecting his latest acquisition. He peered into the Space Marine's eyes. Life blazed there, along with a frenzied, insane fury. He knew that the enhanced human creature could see him. He knew that its conscious mind still remained, trapped forever within the prison of its own body. If it were not so, then his display would be lacking. Satisfied, he shuffled across the battlefield, past hundreds more frozen statues, each carefully positioned as per his grand design. Some were firing weapons or swinging blades. Others were dying, trapped forever in the moment of their deaths. It was glorious. Greetings, friends, and welcome to the Imperium's Most Wanted. I'm Lorcan, and this is Only War. It is the turn of the Witness of 1,000 Epochs to enter our rogues gallery. He is the Overlord of Solomnance, Lord Archivist of the Prismatic Galleries, and he who is called Infinite. Should he have had a say, he might have expected his entry into this collection much sooner, but I hope from one collector to another he'll forgive me. This is a story that spans 65 million years and countless conflicts. Much of the truth will be shrouded in the mists of time and long lost even to himself. But we will piece together what we can of one of the most fascinating characters in the 41st millennium. Whatever becomes of a universe constantly on the brink of cataclysm, you'd be a fool to bet against him being there at the end, ready to capture the final moment. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to thank my Patreon supporters and everyone who has been in touch during my unexpectedly long absence. I've missed you all, and if you're new here, I hope I earn your subscription today. And don't forget to hit the bell of Saint Gestalt. This discussion is as spoiler-free as possible, but I would highly recommend reading The Infinite and the Divine, and the Clone Lord novels, and The War in the Museum and the Infinite Tableau short stories from the Black Library if you have the opportunity. We will begin our story back in the time of legend, when the Necrons were flesh and blood, blighted by their own sun with short lives and obsessed with the inevitable hand of death on their shoulder. A race for all their wondrous technologies and star-spanning empire were still fractious and warlike. The race known as the Necrontyr. Legends tell that the rulers of the Necrontyr struggled to unite their people until they came into contact with the beings known as the Old Ones. The Old Ones were near godlike beings and appeared to possess the secret of near immortal lifespans. The Necrontyr desired these secrets above all else to escape the prison of their cursed existence. But the Old Ones refused their pleas, and in spite and jealousy, the Necrontyr were finally able to unite in a common cause, and launched a war it soon became clear they had no hope of winning. Few cognate details of this war in heaven still exist, and if they do, it is only in the fractured memories of the Necrons themselves. However, Eldari lore suggests that the Old Ones, as creators of the arterial network of ethereal tunnels that spanned the interstices between the warp and real space known as the Webway, used this superiority to outmaneuver the Necrontyr in nearly all engagements, and drive them back on every front. In their darkest hour, the C'tan came before the Necrontyr with an offer of aid. These ancient star gods, beings formed from the fundamental energies of the universe, offered Zarek, last of the Silent Kings, all that his people had ever desired: immortality and power. All it would cost was for the Necrontyr to ally themselves with the C'tan to destroy their mutual enemies, the hated Old Ones, forever. Zarek deliberated long, but in the end he accepted the offer, and in doing so he damned his entire race. What followed was the nightmare process of biotransference that placed the minds of the Necrontyr into living metal bodies and transformed them into the Necrons. The price was their souls, devoured by the leering C'tan, and for all but those of the ruling castes, the obliteration of almost all personality and free will. No more would the Necrontyr war and politic against one another, for their wills were bound to Zarek's control through cast iron command protocols. After the war in heaven, when the C'tan star gods fought the Old Ones, with the Necrons as their imprisoned metal army, the Necrons saw their chance to avenge the deception of biotransference. Rising up, they took revenge on the duplicitous star gods, shattering them into pieces and sealing the shards, each powerful enough to level cities in huge tesseract labyrinths. Despite these apparent victories, Zarek saw that his people's time was done. The implacable Necrons had overtaxed themselves, and of the races created as servants by the Old Ones, the Eldari were poised to ascend as the preeminent race in the galaxy, and their vengeance on the Necrons would be swift and without mercy. It is said that Orokan the Diviner had foreseen the fall of the Eldari and the subsequent rise of mankind, and the Silent King commanded his people to intern themselves within the status crypts of their tomb cities, there to sleep out the eons until they could rise again to conquer all. Finally, destroying his command protocols and freeing his people, Zarek took his ship into the void to seek whatever solace he might amongst the empty darkness. The Necrons slept for 60 million years if the Eldari Book of Mournful Night is accurate, using technology well beyond human comprehension, with hyper-intelligent master programs, and guarded by canoptic slave constructs. Despite their fail-safes and protocols, much changed as the eons passed, and the chronostats of many tomb worlds slipped due to mechanical failure or empiric distortion. Thus, rather than rising up as one across the galaxy, the Necrons have awoken piecemeal. Some emerged from stasis during the days of the Emperor's Great Crusade, while many others slumber still. Nor have the Necrons themselves come through the process unchanged. Corruption has crept into the minds of many, either during the passing ages or while enduring the slow and unsettling process of revivification. Nihilistic madness or mindless stupor claim some, while the personality engrams of others have been distorted by countless subtle derangements. Before biotransference, Necrontyr society had been conservative and hierarchical. The dynasties had fought each other in vicious succession wars and blood feuds. Their culture had built whole rituals, religious and civil, prescribing the proper method of waging war against one's own kind. And Trazyn, a subject of the Nihilak dynasty himself, had been on those bloody fields of war, not a combatant, but as an observer. Even before the transition to metal, his fellows considered him notoriously dogged, even stubborn in his pursuits, and immortality has made him relentless, granting a patience that his frail body of flesh could not tolerate. The process of biotransference burned away much of Trazyn's memory of his former self. In his own musings, his mind reconstructed an image, the curve of long fingers gripping a stylus, dark pupils staring back from a burnished mirror. But the image is fleeting, refusing to be pinned by his mind-eye in what he believes may be self-protection protocols. Trazyn's own memory of his final moments as a being of flesh and bone are equally shrouded in some mystery. Here we need to draw not only on his recollection, but also that of his eternal nemesis and occasional ally, Orikan the Diviner. Orikan and Trazyn were rivals even back to the Flesh times. The diviner seer of the Necrontyr, who warned their kind against accepting the deceiver's horrific bargain, but to no avail as they marched to their doom, believing the C'tan's promises. It is here that Orikan and Trazyn's memories of that time differ. Orikan would state that while he saw the delusion and resisted, Trazyn was only too willing to trade in a failing body, bent by age. Trazyn has often claimed he went to the flames of biotransference in chains, that the memory is distinct in his engrams, the lock collar around his throat, the metal hands grasping his shoulders as he was dragged from the sanctuary of his library. Orikan recalls it differently. He remembers how afraid Trazyn was that the tumors would take his wits, and with it his legacy of work. By stepping into the forges and accepting a new metal body, the weight of mortality would be removed from his shoulders, and the entire cosmos would be his to catalogue. Orikan claims Trazyn has such clear memories because he was there, but he has it backwards. It was Orikan who resisted and went on the run, Orikan who fled to his library, and Trazyn was one of the ones that came to drag him to the furnaces. Trazyn even accepts that Orikan may be correct in his recollection, but cautions that when the deceiver made the metal forms they now inhabit, he may have twisted not only their bodies, but also their engrams, and planted false memories to sow discord amongst the newly created Necron leaders. While we may never know the exact truth, a conversation with the Shard of Mehfran the Deceiver lends weight to Orikan's tale when it states to Trazyn, "Yes, old fool, how apt. That is what put you in this form, is it not? Pain and age. Worry that your failing flesh could not support such a keen intelligence, that your biological system was corrupting the genius of your mind, as if the mind were not part of the body. as if mind and soul were the same. Now, child, you are no different than the dead objects preserved in your gallery. When the war in heaven came, Trazyn, as chief archivist, attended every clash that logistics allowed, recording impressions, taking samples, attending the embalming of each great pharaoh that fell to the Old Ones and their servant races. The titanic clashes as armies of metal marched with dire purpose into the faltering lines of the reptilian Old Ones, the star gods, the ones he would eventually aid to bring low, mouths afire as they feasted on innumerable suns. And then came the servile creations of the Old Ones, the psychically potent Eldari, all grace and silence, and the savage Krork, all rage and clamour, beings designed to be adept at their own particular aspect of violence. The curse of biotransference had made parodies of them all, but none more extreme than Trazyn. He had been remade into a hunched, hooded thing, a scholar eternally at his work, a parody of the frail form he had been so keen to abandon. It is unclear when exactly Trazyn awoke from the great sleep that was to follow, but unlike the Triarch Praetorians, the order of cloistered warriors who watched for aeons over the Necron stasis tombs, he did not eschew sleep entirely. What is evident is he has maintained the single-minded focus over the millennia to collect, catalogue and preserve the wonders of the galaxy for all eternity. While he may command the legions of his tomb world salonments with the skill and cunning to rival any more military-minded Necron overlord, he would argue he does so in service of goals loftier than mere conquest. Indeed, his acquisitive drive knows no bounds, and in its pursuit he will show no mercy. History is always on the march, and Trazyn strives to keep pace. Alas, few worlds willingly give up the artifacts Trazyn seeks of them. However Machiavellian his methods, they selfishly clutch to the few meaningful things in their civilization, rather than offering them up to be preserved for posterity. Trazyn would assert that he takes such measures as are necessary, however extreme they may appear, as he holds his mission to be of paramount importance. Why waste the time it would take to explain himself to a barbaric lesser race, if countless priceless treasures could be lost forever by such inaction? After all, to beings as enduring as the Necrons, most civilizations in the galaxy rise and fall in the veritable blink of an eye. How does one explain to such short-lived beings that their only meaningful contribution to eternity boils down to a handful of trinkets or a few singularly unique individuals? Although an overlord of the Nihilak dynasty, Trazyn has long operated independently, whether under the rule of the Awakened Council, and even now, as the Great Awakening approaches and the Silent King has returned, he still mostly works to his own agenda. Nor are other Necron tomb worlds exempt from Trazyn's attention. To him, his fellow Necrons are no more trustworthy than the many species of aliens he has encountered when it comes to being custodians of the artifacts he craves. The resulting liberations from his light-fingered proclivities have rendered him persona non grata on several tomb worlds. For example, he is forbidden to enter the catacombs of Mandragoria after an ill-fated attempt to gain possession of the Staff of the Destroyer. the potent weapon wielded by Imhotep the Stormlord. Trazyn often prefers to conceal his true identity when travelling from the relative safety of Solomnance, whether adopting a name often lifted from ancient Necron myth, or conducting reconnaissance and even whole campaigns entirely through surrogate bodies, their original owner's will subjugated for the duration of Trazyn's occupation, as the living metal of their necrodermis morphs into an exact facsimile of his form. Thus his true body is protected from the perils of the galaxy, and he is free to go wherever his desire to add to his collection may lead. His moniker the Infinite is particularly apt, as countless times he has been struck down by enraged enemies or assassins of political rivals, only for the body to morph back to that of the original host, as his consciousness is transferred immediately into another surrogate body. When travelling to worlds controlled by humans, Tau or Orcs, Trazyn's dealings are conducted mostly through pawns controlled through mind-shackle scarabs. He knows from past experience, particularly when dealing with the Imperium of Man, to at least act cautiously not to draw direct attention of their more inquisitive organizations. Not that Trazyn is incapable of defending himself. He wields a potent weapon known as the Emphatic Obliterator. Ostensibly it is a stave, 8 feet from pointed base to glowing jade wings on its head. The exact origin of the weapon remains somewhat a mystery. However, as well as containing an inbuilt resurrection orb, it is known to contain a relic from a long-vanished species, possibly even the Old Ones themselves, that is capable of warping reality around itself, disintegrating stone as easily as flesh and bone. Its origin from the war in heaven is further supported by it being an anathema to the shards of the Catan.
History requires 2 parties, the historian and their audience. Without that, one is just talking to oneself. So kindly stop screaming, and you might learn something.
Trazyn is the overlord of the tomb world of Solomnance, and this is where he houses his collection. Solomnance is found in a system all but empty of other heavenly bodies. Its sun is lacking in colour, and on closer inspection is actually an artificial construct, a vast mechanism for capturing excess energy and relaying it back to the planet. An approaching ship will first register sensor echoes when entering orbit, but beyond the perils of toxic clouds and lashing winds, no weapon systems will activate. It appears to be nothing more than a frigid, lifeless husk, bare of any signs of habitation either now or in the past. On first inspection, the planet appears to be covered in a firmly packed silvery sand, but Auspex scans will give the first signs something is deeply amiss. The sand itself is metallic and offers much less resistance than might be expected. Inspection at a microscopic level, the grains themselves can be seen to consume organic matter, stripping efflua and paint from ceramite. There are no land masses, no oceans, no weather patterns outside of the artificial toxic winds, a byproduct of what would be revealed not to be sand at all, but actually an untold number of minuscule solar cells, nano-machines. The reality is that Solomnance is not a planet at all. It is more like an immense spherical starship. The artificial sun does not capture energies from elsewhere in the cosmos. It draws those energies from Solomnus itself, in a continuous loop of energy generation, refinement and return, the crust of nanomachines hiding what lies beneath. When activated, the thick, colourless atmosphere will darken and become punctuated by flashes of sickly green lighting, before the sky itself will appear to lose cohesion in the face of hurricane-force winds. Where the lightning strikes, the sands will crackle and surge, forming gulfs and valleys, and the sounds of ancient architect mechanisms grinding into life will be heard as tremors resonate across the surface. An interloper may find themselves descending through a whirlpool of rushing sands as the lightning spreads amongst them, becoming veins of glowing green in curved, smooth walls, as the nanomachines cease their motion and become firm once more as the locking mechanisms engage. Illuminated by emerald radiance, the visitor will find themselves now on a circular platform, one of hundreds, set equidistant from each other at varying heights, and mounted atop towers of deceptively thin, featureless metal. A single walkway connects each platform to an immense circular tier, one of thousands, rising to impossible heights and descending to imperceptible depths. Each of these tiers is occupied by a labyrinth of prismatic galleries, leading back into the heart of the vast structure that rotates almost imperceptibly, powered by ancient technology known as a Dyson sphere. Trazyn has been collecting artifacts for his galleries for eons, and while he knows his collection better than any being in the galaxy, the sprawling complex of halls and exhibition spaces are in some ways as much a labyrinth to him as to an interloper. This is because the artifact wraiths of Solomnance have standing orders to continue to build outwards, meaning there are whole chambers Trazyn has never visited, but are ready to receive new additions to his collection. The prismatic galleries are a vast, confusing place of winding sepulchral corridors, objects from every major alien species rammed cheek by jowl, time periods intermixed, billion-year-old relics held next to recent acquisitions, galleries that held life-size dioramas of entire battlefields, with thousands of troops frozen in mortal struggle, unimaginable masterpieces of art and architecture sharing space with scenes of indescribable horror, all of it arranged according to some impenetrable symmetry. These sweeping reconstructions of battles, titanic heroes preserved in hard light, recreations of history's greatest moments. Even before the Great Sleep, Trazyn had entertained visitors from nearly every dynasty with his collection of wonders. It also contains one of the greatest document collections in the galaxy, a rival even to the Eldari's famous Black Library. Trazyn, after all, had once been a chronicler and an archivist. Although artifacts were his passion, he never neglected the written word. Although Solomnance is a dormant world, and by Trazyn's calculations its officials, warriors and servants in the stasis death of the Great Sleep will awaken now in just a few millennia, he has needed a mere skeleton crew to keep the world running at the standard he prefers. He delegates to cryptech scribes who catalogue, cross-reference and digitize each work. Trazyn hopes that when the Necron legions are destined to awaken, all of their literature, history and discourses would be accessible, a mnemonic copy sent to the library of each tomb world, a great work for the benefit of all. He is aided in particular by Saneth the Light Sculptor, Trazyn's chief curator, who despite some deterioration of his neural matrix, is highly skilled in the hard light hologram projections that Trazyn has chosen as his method to display his collection. Prior to the Horus heresy, Trazyn had not been much interested in humans. He collected them. He collects everything. But he considered them on the same level as orcs, or various kinds of carnivorous algae. Their spread across the cosmos had destroyed so many more interesting civilizations, and since the rise of the Emperor, their culture had an utter sameness that bored him. If Trazyn cared about the mere ability to propagate and spread, he'd spend his eternity collecting bacteria. The events on Istvan V had provided a rare opportunity to collect Astartes specimens, both heretic and loyalist. Unable to observe the battle itself personally, he found even decades later there had been artifacts lying around unrecovered, most unusual for Astartes battlefields. Also unusual on Istvan V was the number of Space Marines missing in action, although whether this was entirely due to Trazyn is still unclear. The heresy soon came to demand his full attention at the time. He has plans to add a grand tableau of the Battle of Calth, and perhaps even the confrontation aboard the Vengeful Spirit, suspecting Horus's body was likely being venerated somewhere in the Eye of Terror. He has even harboured the desire to add the Emperor to his collection, feeling it is a waste that such a historical figure is simply rotting away on Terra. Trazyn is sure he could do a far better job at his preservation and restoration. However, since the heresy, it appears he has found much more to admire in humanity. Speaking to Orokan on the world of Serenade, he revels in the veneration the human colonists have inadvertently placed upon him. Intervening in a prior Orc invasion has led to his elevation as a saviour of the planet, admittedly as a member of the Silver Skulls chapter of Astartes. They even erected a statue of him in the square. When the Inquisition got wind of it, they removed it for renovation, but he could not help to acquire it for his collection. Although in this case, he hardly thinks it counts as stealing if it is his likeness. And his interest goes beyond academic study or the need for thralls in the future. When challenged on this by Orokan, Trazyn would state,
I admit they have their poor qualities, certainly. Unrefined, without question. Superstitious, no doubt. And primitive, fractious, and grasping as well. Besides, their biology is disgusting. Everything they consume for energy eventually kills them. Their digestive tracts are literal colonies of bacteria, and their reproductive system is the same as their waste elimination system. Did you know that? Yet, despite all these difficulties, they have done a great deal in the galaxy. Their empire may, in time, eclipse the extent that ours was at its height. Perhaps it does already. They have not the coordination to tell. They are born weak, mature slowly, have short lifespans, and in a galaxy packed with creatures that come into the world fully grown and armed with fangs and armored with bone, they have still managed to become the dominant force through technology and will. They remind me a bit of us, or rather, how we used to be, ambitious, but short-lived.
He is also not without something akin to kindness, as is shown in his dealings with the scholar Columna, who has served him on Serenade. Columna states that he has been a kind master, much more so than his human ones. Trazyn would state the rewards he has provided are a fundamental mechanism of good leadership, and that human culture is a terrorized one that breeds obedience, but not loyalty. In the end, he even admits that he will miss his aged human servant when he grants him the release of death. However, he is not without cruel humour, as is seen in his dealings with the two Sisters of Battle in his collection, swearing on his honor not to return them to the exhibit after they provide him with their aid, and even offering to reunite one loyal to Gold Vandaya with her lord. While his words would indeed be true, it would not be in the way either sister would have desired. In the emerald darkness, something gave a harsh, mechanical chuckle.
A fine gift, one among many you have brought me.
The voice echoed out of nowhere, and had an artificial quality to its tone which set his teeth on edge. Metal clanked against stone, growing louder. Fabius turned towards a nearby staircase, torment raised. The sound seemed to be coming from there. "Who is there? Show yourself!"
We are much alike, you and I.
The voice continued. The being descended the staircase, its scaly cloak clattering softly in its wake.
We see a greater picture than is evident to the lower orders. A canvas made up of past, present, and future. Of that I'm sure. We share a magnitude of perception, Chief Apothecary Fabius, Lieutenant Commander of the Emperor's Children Legion.
You know my name. It is only polite that you share yours. Fabius tensed as the being came at last into the light. It resembled the automatons from earlier, but only barely. It was more ornate and heavily armoured beneath its cloak and cowl. Ornamentation of gold and azure decorated its frame, and there seemed to be a mocking expression on its fleshless face. It bore a tall bladed staff, topped by a flickering orb.
Forgive me. I forget the niceties in my isolation. I'm Trezin, called by some the Infinite, Chief Archivist of the Solemnance Galleries, Master of Shattered Moments, Lord of the Great Library.
Trezin pointed his staff at Fabius.
And now, Fabius Bile, you belong to me.
Fabius would be lured to Solomance by the prospect of recovering the lost gene tithe of the Third Legion, nearly 18,000 perfectly preserved progenoid glands originating from before the devastation of the Legion due to the Blight. Trezin would revel in their meeting, drawing comparisons between the two as scholars, and he recognizes both as outliers of their kind. Trezin would reveal to Fabius the history of the Necrons from the time of flesh as the Necrontyr, the war in heaven through to the bargain with the Deceiver, and the betrayal of biotransference, and the vengeance the Necrons wrought upon the Catan once the moment arose. This leads to an exchange of questions between the two. Are you the being you were before you were poured into the metal sarcophagus? Or are you merely the ghost of who and what you once were? Fabius turned slowly, keeping the pacing metal figure in sight.
The same might be said of you. Are you even yourself? Or are you merely a copy of a copy of a copy? The faded imprint of a thing long dead. Yes, I know all about you, Fabius Bile.
Trezin will admit to finding Fabius quite impressive considering the crude tools at his disposal. A cleverness, he says, motivated by necessity, as he is fully aware of the inevitability of the Blight taking hold in Fabius once more. Fabius at least feigns confusion as to why Trezin would have seen fit to strike a bargain in order to add him to his collection, the answer being that Fabius is unique in the universe. a legion of one, the father of monsters. Fabius will claim there are worthier prizes to be had for the true collector, appealing to Trezin's lust for preservation of all that exists. He claims the universe is a riot of the new species, new artifacts, new worlds, that iSpace alone would tax even his mania, and his gene banks are full of samples taken from worlds without number. Whatever he wished, Fabius could make, whether long extinct or newly risen. This would not have the desired effect, as Trezin then contemplates keeping Fabius not as a hard light statue, but in a form that would mean he is awake and aware, so that he could give his undivided attention to the manner of improving his collection. However, as Trezin appears to be settling on this course of action, the arrival of other interlopers onto Solomnance would give Fabius the opportunity not only to escape, but also to rid himself both of some annoying presences, and still leave with the gene tithe he sought, although there is a greater cost to the Third Legion than he would have liked, and a cherished creation he has to part with. Our final tale of Trezin will cast him briefly into the unlikely role of hero to the Imperium, although as with all his dealings, the long-term goals of his intervention are still more aligned with his own proclivities, rather than any misplaced sense of empathy with the struggles of humanity. As Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade moved to its climax, Trezin would come to realize that the destruction that would be wrought on the galaxy by the ruinous powers would greatly impede his ability to add to his collection. It started when the Bell of St. Gestald, an artifact long held in his collection, started to toll in defiance of the status field that contained it. The bell would toll 13 times, each one causing ever-increasing destruction to his precious galleries. Pausing only to cast the bell into the webway where he hoped it would go on to inconvenience the Eldari, he began to ponder the meaning behind its sudden apparent awakening. Trezin travelled first to Thanatos, crown world of the Oruskar dynasty, and home to the Celestial Orrery, a device which could project a holographic representation of the state of the very stars themselves. Prior indiscretions meant his welcome was not warm, but he was eventually able to gain access, if under rather strict supervision. It was then that Trezin realized that the intricate webs that formed the links of the orrery were underlit by a crimson stain that pulsed beneath the weave of worlds like an inflamed infection. The portent was dire, and he spent much time searching for the source of the spreading malaise that was creeping across the stars. Eventually he found it emanating from the world known to the Imperium as Cadia, and taking with him tesseract labyrinths that contained several examples from his Imperial collection, he made his way to the fortress world that bordered the Eye of Terror. On Cadia, he elected to make contact with a being who had set himself the task of determining how to make use of the mysterious Cadian pylons, in an attempt to close off the Eye of Terror from real space, and spare Cadia from the forces of the ruinous powers. Belisarius Cawl. On Trezin's unexpected appearance, Cawl readied to attack, but stayed his hand long enough to hear the Infinite's offer to unravel the mysteries of the pylons that had so far evaded his comprehension, and despite Cawl's understandable hesitancy, the dire situation necessitated he listened to this highly unusual offer of a temporary alliance. With Trezin's guidance, Belisarius Cawl began to master the intricacies of the largest of the Necron-built pylon networks on Cadia's Elysian fields. But unfortunately, this would also be where the Black Legion would launch a massive assault on the caverns in which the Archmagus worked. To give Cawl more time, Trezin would unleash his own collection of Imperial reinforcements. Heresy-era Ultramarines, Contemptor pattern dreadnoughts, guardsmen of various regiments, salamanders thought lost in the Clovian disaster, and alone Custodes entered the fray and stalled the traitors' advance. Also amongst the reinforcements was Inquisitor Greyfax and her bodyguard of the 55th Capic Eagles, and it was the Puritan Inquisitor who would prove pivotal facing off against the Despoiler himself, as Khal managed to get the pylon network functioning long enough to cut off the connection to the Immaterium so vital for Abaddon's demonic allies, and shrinking the Eye of Terror itself. The respite would be short-lived, as despite being forced to retreat off-world, Abaddon would not be denied, and hurled the remains of the Blackstone Fortress, the Will of Eternity, into the planet, destroying the pylons and allowing the Eye of Terror to engulf the Cadian Gate and the dying fortress world. The instability of the warp would extend outwards, eventually cutting the galaxy and the Imperium of Man in twain, creating the Great Rift. For Trazyn, the cause was lost, but he sought solace in the opportunity to add to his collection, seeking a trophy worthy of such a momentous event. As the last of the Cadian defenders prepared to evacuate, the last Lord Castellan of Cadia, Ursarkar E. Creed, elected to die with dignity on the planet he had fought to keep from the clutches of chaos for so long. Left alone as the last transport broke from the planet's surface, Creed, spilling the last of his lifeblood on the soil of his beloved Cadia, stood one last time to face the enemy, but instead came face to face with a metallic giant holding a device of glittering polygons.
Ursarkar E. Creed, this need not be your end. Eternity awaits.
And so reaches the end of our tale of Trazyn the Infinite, he who watches the beleaguered populations of dying planets struggle tirelessly in the futile pursuit of betterment, or prosperity, or survival. And yet, no matter how fleeting their existence, he welcomes all to a place in his carefully curated collection. I hope you've enjoyed our time together, and I've earned your subscription today. And I'll see you again in the near future, where there is only war.